Throughout history, kings and queens sentenced many thousands of people to death in many different ways. Lots of these people suffered for the crime of treason, plotting to overthrow the monarchy or the government. Even those who held different beliefs to the king or queen could be sentenced to death for their actions. But some unfortunate and often considered tyrannical rulers themselves were accused of treason against their own people and for instigating the suffering of their populations. There are some accounts throughout the centuries of kings and queens being dragged out in front of their subjects to be executed in some of the most horrific and ruthless but historic executions in history. But the heads of these kings and queens were subjected to different treatments after the executions. Some were sewn back onto their bodies after death. And in this documentary, we will look at the different kings and queens who were executed and then what happened to their heads afterwards. And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. But the axeman took the head clean off the king in one swift blow, and following this, his head, along with his body, were placed in a coffin ready to be embalmed. The head of Charles I was allegedly sewn back onto his body, but then centuries later, the coffin of the executed king was opened, and what those people discovered was shocking with regards to his head, as it had fallen off of his body. King Charles I walked under armed guard to the Palace of Whitehall the day before his execution, and outside here his execution scaffold had been created. On the scaffold he made a speech to the crowd, and many people were undecided about whether this was something which was necessary. There was a fear in England by parliamentarians that if Charles I was in exile, then he would come back to the nation to invade with a foreign army. But because of this, the decision was made to execute him. Whilst on the scaffold, he claimed that an unjust sentence that I suffered to take effect is punished now by an unjust sentence on me. He also stated, "But I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consists in having government. It is not their having a share in the government. That is nothing appertaining unto them. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things. I shall go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be." At 2 p.m. the king placed his head on the block of the scaffold after saying a quick prayer, and he then told the executioner that he would signal that he was ready to die by stretching out his arms. The executioner had tucked his hair into a nightcap so it would not trouble him. But the executioner, when instructed by the king, thrust down his axe onto the king's neck, and his head was taken off in one swift and clean strike from the axe. The executioner did not show the king's head to the crowd out of respect, and also out of fear of being identified by his voice. He would usually have claimed that, "Behold the head of a traitor," but this wasn't done. Many people rushed to the scaffold and dipped their handkerchiefs in the blood from the scaffold, and then the executioner made a hasty getaway. Following the execution, the king's remains were placed into a coffin which was on the scaffold, and this included his corpse and his head. The coffin was taken back into the banqueting house and the Palace of Whitehall, and they were then taken into a room where the remains were then embalmed. During this process, a number of his internal organs may have been removed, and these probably were, as was usual during the embalming of kings and queens, and these organs were placed into separate containers to be buried elsewhere. But during this, the king's head was sewn back onto his body, and the doctor who did this used a thin thread to reunite the body with the head, and it was then placed inside of a lead coffin. For some time there was a debate as to what to do with the body of King Charles I, and Parliament then settled on burying him inside of Windsor Castle, in the chapel, St George's, and specifically inside of the same vault as King Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. This decision was made as it was considered a quiet place where his body would not be dug up and then venerated as a martyr, and there was a fear that the king's remains would be exhumed and then worshipped by pro-royalist forces. On the 9th of February 1649, the king's remains were taken to St. George's Chapel, and he was buried in secret under the cover of nightfall. And for many centuries, many believed that his grave had been lost, and no one really knew where the body and the head of King Charles I were. But little did people know that he was buried at the heart of the Order of the Garters Chapel, in a small vault in the choir of the chapel in Windsor Castle, interred next to England's most notorious king, Henry VIII, and buried in adjacent vaults to the kings of the Wars of the Roses. It was in 1813 that there was building work occupying the inside of the choir and the chapel, and with this an opening was made with regards to the vault where the body had been placed inside of. Discovered inside of this vault were 4 coffins, one belonging to Henry VIII, which was huge, another belonging to Jane Seymour, Henry's 3rd wife, whose coffin was in a good state, a small coffin belonging to a child of Queen Anne, and also the large coffin of Charles I. But to bed rumours about Charles I's remains being elsewhere, the decision was made to open the coffin of the executed king on the 1st of April 1813. Watching this was the Prince Regent, the future George IV, and it was Sir Henry Halford who was the man who examined the body of King Charles I. They broke into the coffin, and what they found was incredible. Halford discovered that the head of Charles I had fallen off of his body, and that the thread had disintegrated in the years following his execution. When the pall was removed, a plain lead coffin with no appearance of being enclosed in wood was found, and it had the inscription King Charles, 1649. It was said that a small opening was then made in the top part of the coffin lid, and inside the internal wooden coffin it had decayed a lot, but the body of King Charles I had been heavily wrapped in a number of layers of cerecloth, thick wax-coated cloth that was wrapped over the body to preserve it. But the coffin was full, and the cerecloth caused a number of problems with the body, and it became difficult for Halford to unwrap. But Halford even made a sketch of Charles's hand, and then described what he saw. He wrote, "At length the whole face was disengaged from its covering. The complexion of the skin of it was dark and discoloured. The forehead and temples had lost little or nothing of their muscular substance. The cartilage of the nose was gone, but the left eye in the first moments of exposure was open and full, though it vanished almost immediately, and the pointed beard, so characteristic of the period of the reign of King Charles, was perfect. The shape of the face was long oval. Many of the teeth remained, and the left ear, in consequence of the interposition of the unctuous matter between it and the cerecloth, was found entire. It was difficult at this moment to withhold a declaration that, notwithstanding its disfigurement, the countenance did bear a strong resemblance to the coins, the bust, and especially to the pictures of King Charles I by Van Dyck, by which it had been made familiar to us. It is true that the minds of the spectators of this interesting sight were well prepared to receive this impression, but it's also certain that such a facility of belief had been occasioned by the simplicity and truth of Mr. Herbert's narrative, every part of which had been confirmed by the investigation so far as it had advanced, and it will not be denied that the shape of the face, the forehead and eye and the beard are the most important features by which resemblance is determined. When the head had been entirely disengaged from the attachment which confined it, it was found to be loose and without any difficulty, was taken up and held to view. It was quite wet and gave a greenish-red tinge to paper and linen when touched. The back part of the scalp was entirely perfect, and had a remarkably fresh appearance, the pores of the skin being more distinct, as they usually are when soaked in moisture, and the tendons and ligaments of the neck were considerable substance and firmness. The hair was thick at the back part of the head, and, in appearance, nearly black. A portion of it, which had since been cleaned and dried, is of a beautiful dark brown colour. That of the beard was a redder brown. On the back part of the head it was more than an inch in length, and had probably been cut so short for the convenience of the executioner, or perhaps by the piety of friends soon after death, in order to furnish memorials of the unhappy king. When the head was held up, it was said that the muscles of the neck had evidently retracted themselves considerably, and the fourth cervical vertebrae was found to be cut through its substance transversely, leaving the surface of the divided portions perfectly smooth, and even an appearance which could have been produced by a heavy blow inflicted with a very sharp instrument. Henry Halford's work inside the royal vaults with regards to Charles I confirmed a number of things. Firstly, that he had been executed using a sharp weapon, such as an axe, and that this had been performed in one blow, with the executioner being rather skilled. It was claimed that, following this examination of the head, which served every purpose in view, and without examining the body below the neck, it was immediately restored to its situation. The coffin was soldered up again and the vault closed. The head of Charles I had fallen off from his body due to the fact the thread had perished in the centuries, keeping it attached to its body. The head of King Charles I in Halford's sketch shows that 2 centuries after his execution, his hair had been preserved, as had his beard, and his eyes were also clasped shut, but his nose had decayed. The execution of King Charles I is still controversial to this day, but the opening of his coffin also caused a stir, as some believed that it was in poor taste, but it did confirm the fate of the executed king. Throughout history, there have been many kings and queens who were assassinated, and some were even executed. King Henry IV of France was the King of France from 1589 to 1610, and he was the first monarch of France to come from the House of Bourbon. He was a king who would try to balance the interests of different religions. However, in 1610, he was assassinated by a Catholic terrorist, and he was succeeded by his son. He was a king who tried to promote farming and wipe out corruption across the country, but he would also promote trade and oversee a number of improvements to his country. But some hard-lying Catholics hated him, and they would take action. But what is rather shocking is that following his assassination, a head belonging to the king would emerge, and this is still around today, and its mummified state is rather shocking. But there has been debate whether this actually is the former King of France. But what is the story of the head of King Henry IV? Now, despite being a monarch who was generally well liked and who it's believed did a significant amount of good for the French people, others thought that he was a heretic, and especially strong Catholics would greatly dislike him. Because of this, there were 12 different assassination attempts at least on his life. But on the 14th of May 1610, he was assassinated in Paris by Francois Ravaillac. The assassin made different trips to Paris before he waited in the city when the king's carriage passed him, and there was a blockade in the streets and Henry IV was stopped for some time. With this, Ravaillac pounced and he stabbed Henry IV to death. One historian stated of the event, his coach, entering from St. Honore to Fennery Street, was blocked on one side by a cart filled with wine and on the other by a cart filled with hay. Ravaillac climbed on the wheel of the above-named coach and with a knife, trenchant on both sides, stabbed him between the second and third ribs. The king was taken back to rest, but it was clear that he was dying, and within a few minutes he had succumbed to his injuries. Interestingly, his assassin was then pulled apart by horses and was executed in this brutal manner. But during the French Revolution, the rebels would seize and take everything which symbolised the monarchy, and in 1793 they ransacked the burial place and site of King Henry IV, and they then removed his remains and threw them into a common grave. It's believed also that his head was then cut off and was then passed through many hands until it would turn up inside the attic of a tax inspector. This head then turned up and was mummified, and many historians claimed that this was the head of the assassinated French king, and it was said to have facial hairs, a large beauty spot, a broken nose, and also a knife cut to the upper lip from an assassination attempt, and these marks linked it to being Henry. Others were sceptical, but the head was then transferred to being in a bank vault. Such was the value of it. The man who found it said that it was in a loft, in an old wardrobe, was in a box. Inside there was something wrapped in an old tower. The mummified head appeared, well conserved. Impressive, it was a magic moment. The head was also described as there were a few long moustache hairs still visible and others broken at the roots. The nose was broken and bent to the left. The head was a brownish colour with the mouth wide open. Almost all the soft tissue remained. The head had not been cut to remove the brain, and further analysis by a pathologist claimed that the mummified head was linked to traces of blood from the executed French king Louis XVI, which linked the two royals and claimed that the head was actually Henry IV's. There were calls to rebury the head inside of the Basilica of St. Denis, but more recent investigations have erred on the side of caution with the identification of the mummified head. A new DNA study doubted the head and whether it was actually Henry IV's, and it cast doubt that it belonged to the House of Bourbon. The analysis of the head failed to find a match between the head and the three living descendants of the king, meaning that it could not be the former king's, but still, there is the belief that it belonged to the king. The identity of the mummified head is still debated and questioned, but what is for certain is the brutality of Henry IV's death, and he was a king who was considered a good ruler, but he would be assassinated in his capital city. But the mummified head is a haunting object linked to the king, and there have been some questions as to who this actually is. For example, some suggestions that it may have belonged to the executed king, King Louis XVI, but it was preserved in a remarkable state and did belong to someone whose head was hacked off for some brutal reason.
The French Revolution was a pivotal moment in history as the civilian population around the country rose up and sought to abolish their monarchy. No one would have anticipated the bloodshed that occurred after, as the Reign of Terror emerged across France, with around 17,000 people being led to the guillotine inside of different cities and towns. Dozens a day were being executed as figures such as Robespierre wanted to stomp out every piece of the monarchist sympathy as they could. But this was in the aftermath of the execution of the French king, Louis XVI, and he was a king who was not perfect, and he attracted a huge amount of hatred and criticism from his subjects. But Louis XVI would be led to the guillotine himself, where an executioner took his head clean off. But following his death, a mould of his head would be cast, and this was done by the infamous Madame Tussaud, and it shows a rather haunting image of the king in his final moments. King Louis XVI was the last king of France, and along with his wife Marie Antoinette, the Queen, the royal couple attracted a huge degree of criticism. Whilst the French people were starving due to the rising prices of bread, the monarchy was spending lavish sums of money on furniture, parties, and they were gambling away huge amounts of the treasury. Because of the anger, revolution broke out with key events such as the storming of the Bastille, destabilising the monarchy, and eventually the king and queen and royal family were taken into custody. There have been conversations across Europe regarding saving them, but the increasing tension towards them saw the king brought to trial. He was forced to abolish the monarchy, and France became a republic. Louis was himself brought to trial, and he would be brought from the Temple prison to stand before the National Convention. He was accused of high treason and crimes against the state, and on the 15th of January 1793, 721 deputies and members of the convention voted on what to do with him. 693 declared that he was guilty. But the men then had to decide what to do with the king. 361 of them voted for execution, and Louis XVI was condemned to death by one single vote. The immediate execution of the king was then arranged, and this would be the final decision. His execution took place on the 21st of January 1793. On the day, Louis woke up early in the morning. His valet helped him dress, and he then visited an Irish priest to make his confession. He would hear his last mass and receive communion, but Louis was advised to not see his family as it would be too tough. He then confided his final wishes to the priest, that the royal seal was to go to the Dauphin, and that his wife the Queen should receive his wedding ring. Following the blessing, he went to meet the commander of the guard. In the second court, a green carriage was waiting for him, and he then sat in it along with the priest and 2 guards who sat opposite. The carriage then left the temple at 9 a.m, and for over an hour the carriage, which was led by drummers, would process to the place of execution. The drummers played to drown out the sound of any support, and the route to the guillotine was lined by 80,000 soldiers of the National Guard. They were also escorted by cavalry soldiers with their sabres drawn. One supporter of the royal family had gathered a force of 300 men in the neighbourhood of Rue de Cléry. However, he was then discouraged as the men changed their support. At 10 o'clock, the carriage carrying the king emerged at the Place de la Révolution and went towards an area where the scaffold had been erected, where the guillotine was set upon. The guillotine, as a device, was created to execute people as quickly as possible, and the king would give his approval to this years before, but he would never have imagined that his royal patronage would lead him to losing his head on the device. In the square were many guards who surrounded the scaffold with guns, and a crowd carrying pikes and bayonets were also found. His confessor wrote of the journey. The path leading to the scaffold was extremely rough and difficult to pass. The king was obliged to lean on my arm, and from the slowness with which he proceeded, I feared for a moment that his courage might fail. But what was my astonishment, when, arrived at the last step, I felt that he suddenly let go of my arm, and I saw him cross with a firm foot the breadth of the whole scaffold, silenced by his look alone 15 or 20 drums that were placed opposite to me, and in a voice so loud that it must have been heard at the Pont Tournant. I heard him pronounce distinctly these memorable words: "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." Louis XVI then disembarked his carriage and coach, and he was then approached by the executioner, Charles Henry Sansom, who would perform the job. He would, to begin with, not allow the executioner and his assistant to bind his hands together and tie them, but he would then give over when Sansom suggested using a handkerchief rather than a rope. The executioner's men then quickly cut his hair and removed the collar of his shirt to ensure that nothing got snagged in the blade of the guillotine that would prevent a clean cut. He was then led up the scaffold. Whilst on it, he shouted to the crowd and proclaimed that he was innocent, but then a drum roll was ordered to drown out the final sentences and send him towards his death. The executioners then fastened the king to the guillotine bench, and they then positioned this beneath the device to hold it into place. Then, rather rapidly, the blade was released and the king's head was taken off. One eyewitness stated that the blade did not sever the neck, but due to a misalignment, the blade went straight through the back of his skull and into his jaw. But then Sansom grabbed the severed head from the basket, which it fell into, and showed it to the crowd as the people rushed forwards to dip their handkerchiefs in the blood of the deceased former king. The executioner would later state of the execution: "Arriving at the foot of the guillotine, Louis XVI looked for a moment at the instruments of his execution and asked Sanson why the drums had stopped beating. He came forwards to speak, but there were shouts to the executioners to get on with their work. As he was strapped down, he exclaimed, 'My people, I die innocent.' Then, turning towards his executioner, Louis XVI declared, "Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. I hope that my blood may cement the good fortune of the French." The blade fell. It was 10:22 a.m. One of the assistants of Sansom showed the head of Louis XVI to the people, whereupon a huge cry of "Vive la nation! Vive la République!" arose, and an artillery salute rang out, which reached the ears of the imprisoned royal family. Another witness would state, "Here are some unknown details. The executioners numbered 4. 2 only performed the execution. The 3rd stayed at the foot of the ladder, and the 4th was on the wagon which was to convey the king's body to the Madeleine cemetery, and which was waiting a few feet from the scaffold. The executioner wore breeches, coats in the French style, as a revolution had modified it, and 3 cornered hats with enormous tricolour cockades. They executed the king with their hats on, and it was without taking his hat off that Sansom, seizing by the hair the severed head of Louis XVI, showed it to the people, and for a few moments let the blood from it trickle upon the scaffold. But then, after the execution, at some point, Marie Two-Sword, or Madame Two-Sword, was then employed to make a death mask or whole body cast of the executed king, Louis XVI. She would also do the same for Marie Antoinette and other prominent French politicians, and she would have done this before his body was interred. This is interesting, as the king's remains were immediately transported to the Church of Madeleine, as he was not allowed to be buried alongside his father. He was buried in a sense as a commoner, but at some point Madame Two-Sword would have had her hands on the head of the dead king. This would have been done possibly whilst he was still on the scaffold, or in the seconds after, or inside of the cart when his remains were taken to the church. With Marie Antoinette, she would have to sneak into the graveyard to do this, but the head crafted of King Louis XVI would show him in his final seconds, and the countenance of the king following the blade falling. It was said of his burial, "Arriving at the cemetery, I called for silence. A detachment of gendarmes showed us the body. It was clothed in a white vest and grey silk breeches with matching stockings. We chanted vespers and the service for the dead. In pursuance of an executive order, the body lying in its open coffin was thrown onto a bed of quicklime at the bottom of the pit and covered by earth, the whole being firmly and thoroughly tamped down. Louis XVI's head was placed at his feet." But King Louis XVI's death was a momentous moment in history, as it signalled the intent of the French Revolution. His wife would also lose her head on the guillotine, but so would thousands more who supported the monarchy. It was a brutal time across the land, and those who would witness executions would see the streets of cities and towns running red with the blood of the victims.
One of the most shocking moments in European history took place on the 16th of October 1793 inside of Paris, as the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, was taken to the guillotine. The crowds inside of the French capital jeered and hurled abuse at her as she made her way to the nation's razor for her execution. But many across the nation completely hated her. She was a symbol of ridicule, and was known for not caring about her people, as she would dismiss their issues and problems, all whilst she was living a very lavish lifestyle, whilst the French people were starving. However, following her execution, the Queen's remains were hastily buried, but what happened to her head was rather sinister, but captivating. The fall from grace of Marie Antoinette was unbelievable. She had everything, incredible riches and power, but she was then held inside of the conciergerie prison, a prisoner of her own people. She was an Austrian princess, and she was someone who was considered for exile rather than execution. But in the years before her death, she enjoyed the frivolity and lavish expense of the French royal court alongside her husband, Louis XVI. She became queen 4 years after she came to France, and when she was just 18. Marie, the royal court, spent a lot of time gambling and partying and buying expensive pieces of furniture and gifts, and she was even known as Madame Deficit. Some claimed that Marie was not a monster, and she had a great heart, and even adopted some poor children. However, she was someone who many believed was responsible for the issues across the nation. There was a huge amount of suffering in France, and one thing that did not endear the French people to Marie was the diamond necklace affair. In this scandal, a countess had tricked a cardinal to buy an incredibly expensive necklace on behalf of the queen, and many said that Marie tried to get hold of this huge piece of jewellery without even paying for it, and this dented Marie's reputation further. But then the French Revolution emerged as the suffering people rose up, and events such as the storming of the Bastille occurred, with rebels stealing the weapons of the royal prison and taking up arms, and there were many other events that stood to hurt the royal family and their reputation. The King and Queen of France were arrested in the June of 1791, and they tried to escape to Austria-controlled Netherlands, but the royal family were then held inside of the temple, and the nation was declared a republic. This brought an end to around 1,000 years of monarchy in France, and King Louis XVI was sentenced to death for treason against the French people. He did get to spend some time with his family and children before he was taken to his execution in the Place de la Révolution. It was the same guillotine where his wife was also executed. But following Louis's death, Marie Antoinette was left in prison, and she was then moved to the conciergerie months before her death, and this prison became known as the antechamber to the guillotine. Marie was held for 2 months before she was then brought to trial. At the time, she was 37 years old, and due to the stress of her final months, her hair had gone white and grey with fear, and her skin was also very pale. She was forced to undergo a trial which lasted a day and a half, and she was then forced to sit for 18 hours each time in the courtroom. There were a huge amount of crimes levelled against her, including, shockingly, even incest, and Marie denied everything that was put in front of her. The accusations were documented in literature, and these shocked the nation, but despite giving good accounts of herself to the courtroom, Marie Antoinette was sentenced to death, and she was to be executed on the guillotine. In the early hours of the 16th of October 1793, she was found guilty of high treason, depletion of the national treasury, and also conspiracy against the security of the state. Before she was to be executed at the Place de la Révolution, Marie Antoinette's hair was cut roughly from her head to make sure that the guillotine blade would not get caught. She was then taken to a cart to her execution, and she arrived there shortly after midday, and was greeted by the executioner who would take her life. It was the same guillotine where her husband's head had been taken off. The executioner was wearing black, and he would never have believed that he would be executing the Queen of France, who was technically his former boss administering justice across the nation. Her final words were, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to," as she stood on the foot of the executioner accidentally. She was then strapped to the board before she was slid under the guillotine blade, and this was then quickly released. Her head was taken clean off, and the executioner held this up to show the crowd, and he claimed, "Vive la République." However, after her execution, the remains of the Queen were quickly gathered up and were then hurriedly taken around half a mile north of the scaffold to the Church of the Madeleine and the graveyard there. It was here that many executed people were buried. The grave diggers were preparing the grave of the Queen, and they then took a lunch break inside of the churchyard, and this allowed Madame Tussaud to sneak in and get her hands on the Queen's severed head. She quickly then cast a plaster death mask of the Queen's remains, and following this, the Queen's headless corpse was buried in an unmarked grave, and it's presumed that her head was placed at her feet, as was done to mark disgrace. In the years after her execution, Marie's burial site even became a tourist attraction, but her head and body was then exhumed on the 18th of January 1815, and she was given then a Christian burial inside of the Basilia of St. Denis, which was a royal mausoleum. But the death mask that was created of Marie Antoinette and the head by Madame Tussaud is haunting, and it shows the Queen following her execution, and shows her with a short cropped hair and her eyes closed. Her face is also marked and her lips are closed shut, and this is the closest image we have of Marie following her execution. But Marie Antoinette was, to many people across France, a symbol of tyranny and evil, and the old regime which was oppressive and not caring about the population. Her spending and family caused chaos with people suffering heavily, and they made things worse by spending huge sums of money on material goods for their own benefit, rather than helping their own people who needed some sympathy and empathy. But during the Revolution, Marie Antoinette was condemned, and she would be executed in front of a huge crowd.